So representing SDG 12, we have James Lomax, who's the Program Manager Officer for Agricultural Food Systems at, it says UNEP, but it should say UN Environment. So is that UN Environment? See, I've been listening. Simon Badcock, Senior Terrestrial Program Advisor at Conservation International. Jeffrey Muldoon, Senior Manager for Business and Industry for the WWF Coral Triangle. Justin Adams, Global Managing Director for Lands at the Nature Conservancy. Max Everest-Phillips, Director at the Global Centre for Public Excellence at the UNDP. And finally, Mark Devadson, Senior Advisor for Asia at BSR. Gentlemen, you know the rules, we know the rules. I changed the rules slightly. It's 3 minutes or 3 points. So if you can get 5 points in 3 minutes, good, but it's 3 minutes or 3 points. So James, if you could kick us off and show us how it's done, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do 3 minutes.
There we go.
And I'm on a manel. I knew a manel would happen, and we're on a manel. So apologies on our behalf.
A manel.
Yeah. Okay, so SDG 12, what did we discuss? We discussed the SDG 12. This is I suppose the goal that keeps all the rest honest, if you like. This is the one, this is the SDG where business takes a leading role. If business does not take, because business does not take a leading role in the others, it follows policy, etc., but absolutely this is where business gets moving. The other thing we discussed was consumption. Consumption is not being used, and that is the elephant in the room. We are currently consuming far too much for the planet. Consumption has not been discussed. This is the one where it's in. So first point that I want to say is we need integrated approaches, and we need integrated approaches between business and government. We've forgotten how to live sustainably. 2 generations ago, people lived sustainably without thinking they were. They did it because they valued products, they valued what they ate, and they repaired stuff. What has happened? Stuff is too cheap. And I say stuff in a great big inverted commas, because stuff is just stuff. Reporting. Companies have to report. Governments have to report. No window dressing here, please, anymore. If people tell a story, back it up with some hard, integrated reporting. No window dressing anymore. Third thing, food waste is a very good indicator. This is a very practical thing that we can use. We have to measure it, we have to work on it, but it is not a means to an end in itself, it's a point of departure. The arrival we have to see, but it's a point of departure for understanding how we value stuff, how we value food, why food is wasted. And the fourth thing is that SCP, Sustainable Consumption Production, can be used by governments to develop policies. Banks, therefore, can, for example, where, for example, smallholder farmers are using these particular standards, they can increase their credit to these farmers. So that's it.
Perfect. So you finished on role of government with policy. Thank you. I forgot to mention role of government is an interesting part if we can get to it. So Simon.
Yeah, so good afternoon. We had the SDG 13, which is climate action, and so in the background materials, 5 of the SDGs were linked, and I was reflecting and contend that there's probably another 5, so maybe 10 out of the 17 SDGs are deeply entwined or related to the ability for us to have strategies to develop the climate. One of the first observations from our panellists was a really unique case study about what they're doing as a company to address climate change. And one of the salient points was that they were actually changing the conversation, the narrative about what types of products that they should be using to look at competitive advantage going forward. What changes the dialogue within the company? And this was Erin from Interface. So talking really about a transformational change that they've digested presented and translated climate action as the need to go beyond simple targets that where we're aiming to reduce. They want to look at transformational change in terms of how they, as a company, can take a course to take back action. So they've really got an exciting program in terms of going forward and how to look at this as an opportunity going forward. We had Argus Purnomo from Golden Agri Resources was reflecting on some of the challenges as a large-scale plantations company in Indonesia, and noticing that they have challenges in terms of being able to address some of the issues beyond their concessions, and it really does take a lot of opportunities for partnerships, as well as the role of government is critical in terms of facilitating and providing guidance and clear direction in terms of challenges beyond some of the business setting. Ingo Pool provided a fabulous anecdote comparing the situation we're in now with climate action and the opportunity we have to a setting in 1890 where equally faced with the challenge of horse manure, representing a huge challenge that people were using horses, and that in New York it was looking like they'd be under 6 feet if they weren't cleaning up their act. But the way in which that represented an opportunity, and we saw transformational change there. So again, the opportunity to look at this as a way to provide a different business opportunity. The other thing was the conversation we're having, and I think Ingo was able to make some comments on the Singapore radio last night, and he reflected that he was speaking like an expert, and what we need to do is talk about the SDGs as reflecting the opportunity to have a better lifestyle for all of us. And that we need to consider how we speak and engage and communicate. And then finally we had Chris from the Sri Lankan government, who was providing some really wonderful insights, cross-cutting. But the one thing that I thought was exciting was the way in which Sri Lanka had been able to have largely renewable industry through hydro, but then as a matter of course and circumstances had a coal facility. COP21 represented an opportunity for them to have a dialogue with India, because the second coal facility had been committed to with India. The first one was China, and as a result, COP21 provided a catalyst for the government of Sri Lanka to go to India and say, look, you know, we've got these commitments, we can't have another coal generator, can you look at other options? And the Indian government came up with solar. So that was a really great example of how the government is practically taking on some of these challenges. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Jeffrey.
Yes, thanks. So for SDG 14, and I think on this manel, by the time we get to the end of the manel, I think some consistent themes will come out. And one of those will be the overlap. A lot of overlap came through in our first speaker from Amcor in relation to the role of packaging in terms of food waste, reducing carbon footprint, quality of food. Another key theme that was consistent across all the speakers is that of partnerships. Different types of partnerships, different goals, different objectives, but partnerships nonetheless will be the future of how we move forward. I'll come back to that shortly. A particular interesting point that came out of David Clark's from Amcor's conversations were the role that partnerships are playing in trying to elevate certain issues and challenges that we face, and one of these being waste management. How do we elevate that to the level of infrastructure development that we see in roads, and we see in water, and we see in other types of infrastructure developments? From the IUCN, again, partnerships was a critical point that was made by Petch, and in particular the need to look for different types of partnerships. And the fact that IUCN, not traditionally partnering with the private sector, is now looking more at how they can partner with the private sector. He gave a couple of examples in relation to coastal tourism and fisheries, and working with hotel chains, as well as fisheries partnerships with big companies like Thai Union. And a really interesting point that Petch made was that IUCN hosts the World Conservation Congress every 4 years. And he identified a lack of private sector participation in events like that, where there seems to be a real opportunity for them. In terms of government, the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, Marine Spatial Planning, one of the key points that came out of there was the fact that the government can't do everything. They're good at some things, but they're not good at others. And the role of the private sector here is really highlighted. And how do these roles converge? Because the goals of government and the goals of private sector, if we think about it in a business context, are very different in terms of expected rates of return, discount rates, the different metrics that they use to measure success. Lastly, we had the Grand Hyatt. Lucas Granville, the executive chef of the Grand Hyatt, described his journey of the Grand Hyatt in going towards a more sustainable procurement policy within the hotel. They've reduced their seafood products from 600 to less than 100 in a period of about 5 years, and that was about the business case, the long game of why they should think about how they can do this in a better way. The challenges that came up, there were a number of challenges that came up there, and this was one where a real particular challenge was highlighted, was how does an innovator, an early adopter like the Hyatt, reach out to the right partners and get the right information and feedback that they need back. So just to sort of wrap it up, the role of the private sector, critical, and another crucial element is scale. How do we scale up some of what we're already doing in relation to these private sector partnerships? How do we mobilise capital to accelerate some of the nature-based solutions that we think are going to take us forward? And in relation to SDG 14 in particular, in New York in June next year, there'll be a UN conference around SDG 14, and it's critical that we are able to bring to that the role that the private sector must play in accelerating change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. So goal 15, life on land, and the continuing deterioration of most of our ecosystems globally. So the huge rates of desertification, the huge challenges of tropical forest loss and species lost. And so the sort of overall statistics are actually pretty stark. And yet 500 million people are smallholder farmers who rely on the health of land, and more than 2 billion people are integral to those smallholder farmers. So 2 billion people. So we can't solve the SDGs if we're not thinking about the health of our landscape. So there was a sort of a notion put forward by U Tin Hut, a minister from, well, the permanent secretary from Myanmar, that actually goal 15 should be at the heart of all of this, which I think really probably just highlights that all of these goals are integrated, but really life on land and the ecosystems on which we depend for clean air, clean water, things we take for granted, but without them we end up looking like the planet Mars, right? Not great for any of the goals. The great news is that there are some really good shining examples of some good case studies. We had Murray McLeish making a great case that the business case for this, for an agribusiness like Olam, is that productive land and productive people on that land is integral to their entire business. So without it, the agribusiness sector can't thrive and can't do what it needs to do. So there is a clear business case, and we also had Lucita Jasmine from April making the same point from a forestry sector business, that the production of the land that they rely on for their entire operation is essential. So for companies and business operating on the landscape, the business case is quite clear. The challenge is so many businesses take such a short-term view, and what we need is to be able to take a much longer-term view. That then brings in the role of government. Again, you'll see that as a cross-cutting theme, I'm sure, but the importance of good governance, the importance for governance to be participatory, to be transparent, so that we can ensure that we're managing these landscapes in the right way. And we can't get there without good governance. But there are great examples like the Brazil Forest Code, which create good examples of where policy can move forward. We had a very good discussion around knowledge. So we know what good management looks like for landscapes, and for the example in Myanmar of how we get more knowledge out to farmers on the landscapes, given how many 70% of the population is still farming in Myanmar. So knowledge, we also heard that every single farmer has a smartphone. So how do we use technology to get knowledge out, the democratization of knowledge, so that farmers can actually see and create a breed of agripreneurs to move some of these solutions to go forward. The role of finance and thinking about innovative finance solutions, and it's challenging in this area because we don't price natural capital, but the role and opportunity to think about innovative finance solutions is very real. And then I'll end with partnerships and the role of partnerships, which again cuts across everything. But one of probably the biggest theme we talked about was integration. And when you look at a landscape, it's about agriculture, it's about forestry, it's about conservation, it's about infrastructure, it's about people. And all of that needs to be thought about in a more integrated way. Less and less people in the developed world are living close to the land. People who are living closer to the land haven't got that same understanding. So how do we share the tools and the knowledge to think about integration in a new way, create new partnerships to take some of the solutions that we know are available to scale?
Brilliant. Thank you, sir. Max.
Thank you very much, and I think that very neatly leads on to SDG 16, which is looking at peace, justice, and effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. We particularly looked at, because this is such an enormous subject, we focused on the potential for technology, and particularly new technology, a sort of game changer in this. And we had Microsoft and Facebook representatives, as well as the UN Global Pulse, which is looking at big data, and a representative from the government of Singapore to ask how is technology really going to potentially alter this. And we came up with various ideas, particularly around the importance of the 4 C's, which were to do with the importance of connectivity, the role of, sorry, I've forgotten the 4 C's, even though I heard it twice, which might have made it 8 C's. But the importance of communication, the complexity and how new technologies are changing the capacity to engage with complex data and complex solutions. The importance of cognitive bias, and this was particularly stressed by one speaker, that new technology enables us to look at the challenges around policy making in a new light. And the idea of sort of what was described as connectivity muscles, the potential, not muscles as in the sea, but muscles as in the capacity to act and create connective relations between citizen and state, all of which are changing, potential strengths and weaknesses. In that, the importance, of course, of overcoming the digital divide. And we spent quite a long time, which is highly relevant in the case of Singapore, of wondering about how the cloud fitted in with blue skies thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Mark.
Thank you. So we talked about Goal 17, partnership for the goals, perhaps the enabler to all the others, the place where ideas need to be turned to action. We started off by recognizing that maybe MDG Goal 8, which was pretty well the same without the targets, failed to meet expectations, although much of the MDG initiative was a success. So the pressure is on Goal 17 to work. The panel came from DSM, Autodesk, Japanese government, and Grow Asia, so quite a diverse panel. I did notice a few people stayed for a second round, so I'm not sure if we were clear or unclear, but it was good to see a few familiar faces.
Or checking you were consistent.
We often talk about 3-way partnerships between civil society, government, and private sector, and the need for that. But one of the interesting things that came out a few times was What about the consumer? What about the investor? And is it a five-way partnership that needs to be formed? Because where's the consumer in all this? So that was an interesting one. We talked quite a bit about failure, experimentation, and learning. We need to embrace safe experimentation. 90% of all businesses fail, so how is a government going to trust in that environment? So maybe this idea of safe experimentation is interesting to look at. We need to embrace long-term thinking. And we did a bit of talking about competition, and there was some talk about complementary relationships. Complementary partnerships probably have a greater capacity for success. The other area around this working together was the requirement for humility, lack of hubris. And we ended up having 2 dialogues around the nature of marriage and dating agencies as well. So we were spinning off in a direction.
That's a kind of a partnership.
It was all about partnership. The other one, just about government. Yamaguchi-san from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, fascinating work by the government to form deliberate, specific organizations to drive the SDGs, and also within Keidanren and other private sector areas, deliberate new bodies and roundtables being formed to advance the agenda. And it's maybe worthwhile looking at what other governments are deliberately doing this work. And then lastly, IP. We talked a bit about IP and the nature of companies being competitive. When Elon Musk puts his battery code out there, who's taken it? They all want to invent their own thing. Yeah. And in order to advance change, maybe that needs to stop.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask you each one question, and you've sort of alighted on it with that, but I'm going to let you have the last word because it is about partnerships.
Okay.
Everybody, pretty much in one language or another, mentioned the word partnership, and we heard it through all of them yesterday. We heard about integration and partnership. I've been going to conferences like this for years where I've heard about partnerships, and everybody talks about partnerships, and we've been talking about it for a long time. Do you get a sense that there's a different type of partnership being talked about, or are we still going to be talking about partnerships in the same way? Do you get a sense that we're talking about, was there a sense on your panels that people were talking about a different type of a partnership, a different approach to partnering than we've been talking about for the last 5 or 10 years? Maybe I'll just go down the line and see, just thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I think, thanks. Partnerships can be very easy, but we need to get to the nitty-gritty. We need to get to some pretty difficult ones. I mean, it's all very well that we're here at the Responsible Business Forum. We've got PwC, and you've got a whole great team working on sustainability, and a lot of people here very much talk about sustainability. Many people don't. So how are we going to engage with those companies that don't care? And that, I think, is the most important thing. And there are values. So, for example, we could talk about partnership as something that, kind of I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Or are we going to get to some of the critical issues that I quite frankly are missing right now in the dialogue, which is about how to get value back into our products, how to get a more sustainable way of working and living.
And did you get a sense from your panel that people were starting to seek to answer that challenge, or
well, it was more in the room. I mean, we had a very good panel, of course, but I think the dialogue in the room was more about it's not good enough what we're doing right now. We have to take that extra step. When are we going to get to these really nitty-gritty, dangerous things?
So we need to find the way of doing that still.
Yeah, and also at the RBF, how are we going to engage those that don't want to be engaged?
Well, yeah.
Bit of a weird question, but you know what I mean.
We know exactly what you mean. Did you sense that there's a change in the way you were talking about partnerships?
Well, 2 points. I think one of the reflections following the discussion by one of the panelists was that it's actually quite challenging to effectively marry between sometimes institutions that are quite different in terms of how they operate, whether it's a company, an NGO, civil society, or clearly the private sector. And I think one of the concessions is that it's got to be built and constructed, and there's got to be give and take, and you will be dealing with different organisational positions and contexts and maturity in terms of the journey they're going on. So I think one of the key things is to have shared vision in terms of where you can, beginning that journey, have an alignment. I think the other point that was made just about how do we engage with the companies that are not here. How do we? This is really critical, I think, in some geographies around the planet, particularly around tropical forests. And I was in Thailand last week, and one of the overwhelming kind of comments was, don't lift the bar too high, and this is for the palm oil sector. Don't keep aiming to have the bar too high, because we need to bring more people to the table that aren't currently here. So I think that builds on your point.
So that's about bringing different people to the partnerships as opposed to a different kind of partnership.
I think 2 points from me. I think, it's the type, the partnerships aren't always smooth. And I'll use an example of the Coral Triangle. And sometimes partnerships come about not through planning, but just through serendipity. And you grab those opportunities when they come. So the Coral Triangle Initiative was one of those where strong leaders at the top of government were able to come together and agree on the importance of conservation and biodiversity in this particular part of the world. And that partnership hasn't always been smooth. But I think the other thing is partnerships, and this came out a bit in our session, is partnerships more strongly linked back to the profit motive, but with an positive environmental outcome. And I think it came up in the plenary this morning. There's this very strong need to be able to demonstrate that it makes business sense to have the partnership. We talk about some of the companies that aren't here and how do you engage with them. Well, if they don't want to engage with you, it's going to be very difficult to engage with them, but you need to be able to engage with them in a way that they understand.
Yeah, sometimes the P as in the profit word gets in the way of the partnership. Justin?
I think we're talking about the same partnerships, but I think we've got a slightly more sophisticated understanding of what it means and actually how difficult it is, because partnership to say is very easy and partnership to do is very difficult. Yeah. So I think we're fundamentally talking about the same kinds of partnership that we've been talking about for many years. We've got some good examples, but we don't have enough examples. But the main point I would make is I think we don't have a good enough I don't think we pay sufficient attention to the skills that are required and the mindset that's required to actually properly partner, because it inevitably takes more time, and we live in a world where we have no time, or we believe we have no time to do it. And there's that lovely African proverb, as if we want to go fast, then go alone, but if you want to go far, then go together. And we've got to go far, and therefore we've got to go together, but it's going to take time to get that right.
We've got to go far and fast.
And we've got to get there fast. But that's the constant sort of tension, isn't it? Because we're always sort of going fast. We live in a world where things go faster and faster and faster, which makes all of this kind of conversation that much harder.
Okay, thank you. Max?
My reflection on this is that whilst we haven't really discussed the public sector, the role of intrinsic motivation in public officials, and indeed their capacity, but also their sense of purpose, is critical. That sustainable development goals will not happen if the public sector is not, in essence, also determined to make that happen, and what is therefore needed to build that sense of purpose, and particularly look at intrinsic motivation. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, a very important dimension to this, which slightly at a tangent from the main theme, but nevertheless, responsible business cannot act effectively on the sustainable development goals without a strongly motivated public service determined to make this happen.
That sort of links to what Simon was saying about shared vision.
Absolutely.
So if they've not got that intrinsic motivation, which is the same vision, then...
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Mark.
Yeah, I think the nature of the long-term challenge is that the partnerships that we're contemplating will, by definition, have to be multi and varied because of the myriad of targets and solutions being addressed. So they're not all going to be the same, and they're not all going to have one component from every part of society. I think being clear on the complementary roles and respectful of unique differences is an important thing that will be what signifies successful partnership rather than defining what partnerships need to be formed. And I think the other thing I would say is there's a lot of partnerships and organizations that are now in the process of being repurposed as a result of the SDGs. And it's quite easy to say, oh, they're just retrofitted, they were already there. But actually, it gives them a new purpose. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. There are a lot of organizations in place already. Let's repurpose them. And I saw that being described quite eloquently in Japan as well.
And it's interesting that, just to close on that, one of the things I've heard about the SDGs, of course, some companies have been working on sustainability for years, and the SDGs come along. Some of them are using the SDGs, just like you've described, not just to repurpose, but almost as a sense check. Does this make sense in this world of the SDGs? Yeah. And it can re-legitimize what you were doing, because it says, yeah, that's in line with what now sits in this better framework that we've got. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. If I could ask the audience to do the usual appreciation, and if I could ask you to leave. Thank you.